You're listening to the Monocle Daily, first broadcast on the 25th of June 2024 on Monocle Radio.
Moldova and Ukraine take the first formal steps on the long road to EU membership. Protests against new taxes in Kenya may require new taxes to pay for the damage. And of all the attractions and wonders of London, one distinguished visitor chooses to visit a floodgate. I'm Andrew Muller. The Monocle Daily starts now. Hello and welcome to the Monocle Daily, coming to you from our studios here at Midori House in London. I'm Andrew Muller. My guests, Patricia Cohen and Sir William Patey, will discuss the day's big stories, and we'll hear from Illia Ponomarenko of the Kyiv Independent about his new book recalling the early weeks of Ukraine's resistance. Stay tuned, all that and more coming up right here on the Monocle Daily. This is the Monocle Daily. I'm Andrew Muller, and I'm joined today by Patricia Cohen, global economics correspondent for the New York Times, and by Sir William Patey, political consultant and former UK ambassador to Afghanistan, Sudan, Iraq and Saudi Arabia. Hello to you both.
Hi, good to be here.
Hey there.
You've earned it, I think, William, but after those arduous diplomatic postings, you have recently been undertaking less arduous travel.
Yes, I've been lecturing on a cruise ship, very high-end cruise ship, and I've had 2 weeks of just absolute indulgence, butler in my suite and hot and cold running champagne. It's been lovely.
What were you actually lecturing on?
Well, I lectured on being an ambassador in conflict on Saudi Arabia and Afghanistan. I only had to do 3 lectures, so I was pretty underutilised.
This sounds like a fantastic racket. My only follow-up question, William, is who is your agent?
I have a very good agent, but I'm not telling you who she is.
But Tricia, you have not clearly got William's agent because you have not been giving very few lectures for 2 weeks of luxury aboard, but you are going.
And I don't have a private butler either, I should just mention.
Yeah, do they let you keep the butler? Or?
No, the butler stays with the ship, I'm afraid.
That's upsetting. Patricia, you will be travelling unbuttled, if that is the phrase. You're going to France and Italy.
Yes, for a mixture of work and vacation. So we're combining the two.
What is the nature of the work? Are you allowed to say what stories are you chasing across Western Europe?
I've been writing a lot about European competitiveness and whether there's a competitiveness crisis. So maybe on another program we can discuss that.
We can. I just want to come back one more time to the cruise, William, because it is a hilarious thought. Who goes on these things? And I'm actually asking in spirit of genuine inquiry. I did not mean that to sound incredulous. Who is paying for 2 weeks at sea, listening to the thoughts of William Patey?
Well, they have a lot of people have a lot of money because they're not cheap. So the people I met were former judges, former U.S. servicemen. Half of them are Americans on the cruise, a bunch of Aussies. They all seem to have made some money during their careers and are now spending it in indulgence. So I met a media mogul and a few others. So they're a fairly mixed bunch, actually.
Well, we will have more from you both shortly, but first of all, it is a big day for Ukraine and Moldova, which today began the accession talks, which will, if not anytime soon, hopefully usher both into the European Union. Earlier, I spoke to Moldova's State Secretary for European Integration, Rodica Crudu, who is at the launch of the talks in Luxembourg. I began by asking if there were any firm ideas about a timeline from here to Moldova's membership.
In today's conference, we're going to express that the Moldova's position is to get prepared for the accession by 2030. This is the year we set as a timeline to do all the necessary reforms in order to align to the EU acquis, but also to set up efficient mechanisms to implement those acquis, so making sure that these are providing benefits to all our citizens.
I think it's fair to say for most countries that join the EU, the imperative is primarily economic, and I'm sure there are huge economic enticements for Moldova as well. But for Moldova, how much of it is about security, the idea that you will be more protected from Russia if you're inside the EU? Because, of course, as things currently stand, Moldova cannot join NATO because it is constitutionally obliged to neutrality.
Yeah, indeed. But it has to be mentioned that EU was considered as a project of peace and reconciliation among the countries. And therefore, for Moldova, European integration is the only one way to ensure security and peace in Moldova, especially considering the regional situation that we have a war at our borders, and therefore it becomes geopolitical strategic to ensure that our efforts to integrate into the EU will bring peace and would ensure security in Moldova.
And just finally, how confident are you of public opinion in Moldova staying what is likely to be a long course towards EU accession? I know President Sandu, who is very much in favour of this, faces re-election in October, and there will also be that referendum on constitutionally enshrining Moldova's EU ambitions, much as Georgia has, for all the difference that currently seems to be making. What happens if neither of one or both of those votes isn't carried? Does the process continue?
The government of the Republic of Moldova, not only the presidency, but the whole country sees the European integration as the zero priority of the country, is the only way to ensure prosperity, security, and peace in our country. So far, the opinion polls in the Republic of Moldova show that more than 63% of the population are in favor of the European integration. And we do really hope that the referendum that will be held along with the presidential elections on October 20th will manage to have a positive turnout and a positive result. Of course, we are determined to work towards this, to communicate more to our citizens. What does it mean? What are the steps that we do undertake in order to make the European integration dream come true? What are the benefits that we stand to gain by when we will be members of the European Union? So to make sure that every citizen understands that this is not a political, it's not a, let's say, a wish or a dream or an objective of the current president or the current government, is something that the whole society desires and wishes. Because at the end of the day, European integration means a better life for every citizen. That's why we will communicate, and we are communicating, but we are determined to communicate even more to reach the hearts of every citizen and to make them understand that this is something that we want for the prosperous future of our kids and future generations.
That was Moldova's State Secretary for European Integration, Rodica Crudu. Let's bring in our panel on this, Patricia Cohen and William Patey. William, first of all, admittedly, this isn't going to happen soon. I mean, if we look at North Macedonia as a benchmark, whose talks, I think, are now in year 20. But nevertheless, should the EU be a little bit concerned about where these two countries in particular are concerned about buying trouble? As where we are right now, both of them are substantially occupied by Russia.
Yes, I know political betting is pretty controversial at the moment, but I'm prepared to put quite a lot of money on that Moldova will not have become an EU member by 2030, as the State Secretary suggested that was their ambition. I think there is a problem. I mean, we've seen Ursula von der Leyen say that attacks on EU members, although there's no security alliance and the EU has no security pact attached to it, there is a sense in which if you had an attack on an EU member, there would be quite a lot of political pressure to come to the aid of that member, even if they weren't members of NATO. So I think there is a problem if Moldova were to join, and Ukraine and Georgia were to try and join the EU. You are buying some trouble. I don't subscribe to the Nigel Farage point of view that Putin has been provoked into invading a neighbouring country, but there is an issue there about the politics of all this, and if Moldova deliberately wants to join the EU as part of its security and defence rather than for economic reasons, then they clearly have an ambition.
Well, nevertheless, and all those reservations acknowledged, Patricia, is it an important and possibly even constructive signal to send to Russia? Because to the extent that what Russia has done over the last 2 and a bit years makes any sense at all, which is limited, but it is an inability to tolerate the idea of any more of its former sphere of influence looking westward. If the signal is sent to Russia that, look, this is happening, you don't have to like it, but it is happening. This is one-way traffic. Moldova and Ukraine, if not next week, if not even in 2030, but eventually will be EU members, and there's not much you can do to change that.
Well, I think, first of all, that really what's happening today is mostly symbolic, and it's just to send that message to Russia. Whether that's a message that will be accepted, I'm not sure. In fact, Putin has given every indication that he's not willing to accept that message. And in fact, that is what ultimately spurred its invasion back in 2014 of Crimea in the first place, was when Ukraine switched governments and started to look towards the West and talked about for the first time joining the EU. I would also add, though, it's not only the political issues. So there's also a lot of economic issues that would come up if Ukraine and Moldova came up for membership. Ukraine would be by far the largest territorially and the poorest, though. And when you think about all the fights that are erupting now over agricultural subsidies and other subsidies that the EU gives, you could see why it would be very contentious.
Well, to Seoul now, where the finance ministers of South Korea and Japan have been conferring, and let's all hope this item picks up steam shortly. It is perhaps a further sign of the recent hesitant thaw between the two countries, which have a history of mutual rancour, but a present of shared concerns, mostly pertaining to China and North Korea. The meeting comes ahead of a further confab in Washington, D.C., involving South Korea and Japan's ministers of trade and or industry. Patricia, first of all, if relations between them are warming up dramatically, and if all this is a demonstration of that, it does kind of seem, if you take the history off the table, which they've both been reluctant to do, it seems kind of natural. It seems like they should obviously be allies, given what they have in common where they are in the world.
I mean, it's interesting, given the last subject we were just talking about. It feels like we're going back to the future in terms of the Cold War alliances. And here what's basically happening, I think, is the same thing, where, fear of Cold War alliance between North Korea and Russia and possibly China is pushing Japan and South Korea closer together. I mean, like everything, there's a lot of historical animosity, not to forget that Japan was a colonizer, an invader back to World War II. And so there's long histories there. But I certainly think that there's a lot of pressure now, given the changing geopolitical situation.
William, is it a reasonable diplomatic rule that countries, if they realise that their interests are served by putting the past behind them now, will put the past behind them? Do countries, I guess what I'm grasping towards is the idea that maybe pursuing historical grievance is something of an indulgence you can enjoy during good times, but when times are harsh, what you actually need is friends in the moment.
Well, I suppose Britain and France are the classic example. We've fought wars over many centuries, but when it came to the crunch, we were on the same side. I think it's true, but it is interesting that it took the Japanese, the South Koreans and the Americans until last year to come up with a tripartite agreement. That is a testimony to the the history, the bad history between South Korea and Japan that's taken this long, when Japanese, American, and Republic of South Korea's security and economic interests have been aligned for quite some time. So I think the sort of more aggressive Chinese approach in the whole region, and the willingness of Russia to engage with North Korea, I think has finally made them forget those historical grievances. And fair dues to the Japanese, they've been doing quite a few apologies over the years, and maybe the South Koreans are ready to accept them.
Actually, Patricia, on that thought, I was wondering if there was a Russia angle to this. And of course, William just touched on what that might be, that Russia seems to be ever keener to embrace North Korea. It takes all sorts, etc. But could the disruption caused by Russia's attack on Ukraine way over on the other side of the world have caused countries, even in the Pacific, to realise the world might be entering one of those periods we should probably pick a side and figure out who our friends are?
Oh, I think that's definitely the case. But I don't only think it's Russia. I mean, it's also, as you mentioned, China has gotten more aggressive. North Korea has gotten more aggressive. I was in Seoul in February when North Korea, for the first time since the Korean War, said that it was no longer interested in reunification and that it saw the future ultimately as taking over South Korea. I mean, the concern now, though, between Russia and North Korea is one that North Korea could supply Russia's war machine in Ukraine. And then in reverse, perhaps, could Russia in turn help North Korea's nuclear desires for nuclear weapons to increase its capabilities. So that's definitely hovering in the background and a big concern.
And just to follow this up quickly, Patricia, and sort of angle it towards your usual reporting beat, is part of this Japan and South Korea trying to find a way to trade and cooperate with each other more than either of them do with China?
I mean, there is, we are seeing a little bit of more of, I hate the ungainly term friendshoring, but where allies are looking to strengthen their supply chains and economic ties in trade with friendly countries. So that is something there. But I really think in this case, it's more kind of the geopolitical concerns that is pushing the relationship.
And just finally to you, William, and going back to that thought of how and when to set historical grievances aside, and obviously the airing of historical grievances is often driven by politics and by politicians who perceive advantage in pointing at the neighbours and complaining about that thing they did back whenever it was. But if you are the diplomat in charge of conveying the government's message, how hard actually is it to pivot from, yeah, boo, they did all the bad things, to actually it's all fine, we're all friends now?
Well, it's not necessarily easy, but if like the Japanese, you're apologising for your historical mistakes and your some redress for the Korean, the Korean prostitutes, the war service. I think the thing they put behind is you can not mention the Sea of Japan and the Eastern Seas. These are one of the great disputes. The sea between Korea and Japan. Japanese call it the Sea of Japan. The Koreans call it. You can just quietly not mention these things, and you just have to get on with it. It's not too difficult. We're 80 years on. So it's a reasonable time in the life of any of the current diplomats. None of them will have any direct memories of the bad times.
Well, to Kenya now, where just as 400 Kenyan police officers have set off on a peacekeeping mission to Haiti, the need may have arisen for their flight to be turned around. Some of the complex, which houses Kenya's parliament, is on fire amid widespread mayhem following the introduction of some clearly unpopular taxes. Police have certainly launched tear gas in a bid to disperse the crowds. Further reports suggest that they have fired rubber bullets at the very least. And bringing us up to date in the last few minutes, Voice of Africa now reporting that at least 5 protesters have been killed and dozens injured when Kenyan police fired live bullets into demonstrators trying to storm the Parliament building in Nairobi. This is still developing, Patricia. It's obviously extremely bad. Does this strike you as the kind of situation which could unravel properly?
I think it's very concerning. I mean, Kenya has been kind of an East African economic powerhouse. It's got 54 million people, and it's long been seen as this kind of anchor of stability in the region. But Kenya is facing the same troubles that a lot of African nations are, which is this crushing debt crisis, which has come in the wake, obviously, of the COVID pandemic and then rising food and energy prices that were sparked after the Ukraine war and rising interest rates around the world. And so they're just caught between this rock and a hard place. On the one hand, they need to raise revenue in order to pay off interest on the debt, as well as provide basic services. But on the other hand, people are really suffering in terms of lower standards of living because of rising food and fuel costs. And that's exactly what has touched off these protests because of increased taxes.
William, nobody, I don't think, really enjoys paying taxes, and it's hard enough to remain popular raising taxes even in a relatively wealthy country, which Kenya is not. And it's understandable at that level the demonstrators are animated by this sentiment that, well, none of us have got any money and you want to take more of it off us. But President William Ruto has been trying to make the case, but if you want better public services and a reduction of that crippling debt that Patricia was referring to, somebody's going to have to pay for this.
Well, we know from our own experience that nobody gets elected on the basis of increasing taxes. I mean, they should have, part of our development assistance to Kenya should have been how to raise taxes surreptitiously, which is what this government have done. But, it is very difficult. And it probably raises the case again for looking at debt. The sort of debt that developing countries have, and Gordon Brown was one of those who tried to raise the alarm over this and debt forgiveness, and that seems to have gone off the agenda because you can't have countries with crippling debt; they've got no future. And if countries like Kenya go down the path of instability in the way that places like Somalia and others have, then the world, East Africa, begins to look a very dangerous place indeed. So there needs to be a balance there, and of course it does. Revolutions have been sparked by less, and what's at stake now is how does the government respond to the protests? That itself, if they respond violently and there are deaths and there are more protests, then that leads to a revolutionary outcome. I suspect the government may back down on this.
Well, they have backed down once or twice before, Patricia, or at least backed off. There was an original idea for a 16% tax on bread, which wasn't terrifically popular, and indeed, to be honest, sounds like the kind of outrageous thing you pitch with a view to dropping it so you can sound reasonable. But even if these protests subside relatively shortly, does a country like Kenya have any other good options other than trying to tax its own people and trying to explain why that's necessary? I
mean, the problem is, just as we were saying before, it's the global debt crisis. And that is a problem that is partially, the responsibility of the governments, but it also has to do with the international financial system and a global financial architecture that I think is really outmoded and doesn't serve its purpose anymore. There was a recent report from the UN that I was writing about that showed that 46 countries now pay more on their debt service than they do for health care. I mean, that's just not a tenable situation. And most of those countries, by the way, are in sub-Saharan Africa. And so unless it comes some kind of resolution to the debt crisis of these countries, they're not going to be able to tax their way. There isn't the revenue there. Just
a final thought on this, William. You mentioned this, and you're right. I can recall a time when debt forgiveness was all the rage. It was, and the logic of it seems pretty straightforward. That on the one hand, you're having to write off a lot of debt, but on the other hand, that is a short-term expense which will forestall much greater longer-term costs. I mean, as you were suggesting yourself, if a country the size and importance of Kenya should become properly properly unstable. That's an absolute nightmare for the world far beyond East Africa. Why did that idea kind of recede from the consciousness?
I don't know. I'm trying to wonder why it did. I mean, there was a big debt forgiveness in the last global crisis, but now it's affecting a lot of different countries to different degrees. I mean, there it was a kind of systemic problem and a recognition that none of that debt was going to be repaid anyway. So you had to sort of draw a line under it. There's always a balance between writing off debt and encouraging irresponsible future behaviour. How do you write off the debt and encourage responsible behaviour in the future? That's always the balance. But if a country is not going to move forward if they've got an unpayable burden of debt, you've got to find another way. It's as simple as that, or you end up with catastrophic consequences, which all come back to haunt you.
I mean, there is another reason why it's much more difficult now. So previously, you had maybe a handful of big Western banks that were responsible, where the debt had flowed through for much of the developing world. But that world doesn't exist anymore. Now you've got thousands of lenders. China has become a huge lender, which it was not 20 years ago. And now getting all these people in a room together and hammering out a negotiation is much, much harder. Also, a lot of these agreements, these loan agreements, they're not transparent. We don't know the details of them and such. So the very process of negotiation is much, much more complex today.
Well, here in the UK, we are about 10 days away from a general election, which generally anticipates a change of government, if not a downright spectacular shaking up of the political order. But it is business as usual for the country's head of state, untroubled as he is by the necessity of periodically seeking permission to continue. King Charles III is hosting Emperor Naruhito of Japan on a full-dress state visit, as part of which, of all the attractions of London, very arguably Earth's most interesting city, the Emperor has visited the Thames Barrier, i.e. an apparatus of 10 sluice gates near Charlton. William, first of all, a question of diplomatic protocol. Does it strike you as odd that this state visit was not punted once the election was called?
Very difficult to do that. They're years in the planning. This would have been at least a year in the planning.
Indeed.
And as it's head of state to head of state, it doesn't actually. I mean, obviously the Prime Minister's involved, but I thought it would have been quite difficult to punt it, given that the last state visit by a Japanese ruler was in 1998, and given the importance of Japan and the relationship, I think it's a good idea to keep going.
Well, to the visit itself, Patricia, when you first arrived in London, this fabulous metropolis, repository of history, culture and everything else under the sun, how far down your list of things you must see was the Thames Barrier?
Actually, that wasn't on the list. But, now I'm going to rethink that choice.
I mean, it's been described as the eighth wonder of the world, so I think you're downplaying it.
Described as the eighth wonder of the world by whom, William?
Somebody, I read it somewhere.
Okay.
By Emperor Naruhito, actually, who wrote his thesis on the Thames.
Well, indeed. He does appear to have a genuine interest in engineering pertaining to water and flood prevention and so on. And so, yeah, I can see if that's where your head is at, then the Thames Barrier is quite exciting. But I did, again, want to prevail upon your experience of the diplomatic world. William, what's the oddest or most surprising request you've ever heard of from a foreign dignitary?
Well, I mean, personally, the most difficult one was King Abdullah came to the state visit to Buckingham Palace.
Of Jordan?
No, King Abdullah of Saudi Arabia. And normally the 4 or 5 most important members of the delegation would stay at Buckingham Palace. Mm-hmm. So that would have been King Abdullah, the Crown Prince and the Foreign Minister. But there was no room because King Abdullah insisted that all his tea boys and incense burners be there. So they were the only ones in Buckingham Palace with the King. All the other senior delegation members had to go somewhere else. And I remember being in Buckingham Palace with Her Majesty, waiting for King Abdullah to come downstairs, and there was a lot of smell of incense. And I said to Her Majesty, "It smells a bit like the Middle East." And she said, "Yes, doesn't it?"
Well, you can't expect a chap to spend an entire weekend away from home without his tea boys and incense burners.
Well, nor did we. We accommodated him.
Well, indeed. So, I did want to ask you both in turn. I'll ask you first, Patricia, if by some bizarre sequence of events you did find yourself head of state of somewhere and therefore invited back to London in that capacity. And obviously, I'm assuming if you are the head of state at the centre of a state visit, you can pretty much go and see anything you want to go and see. What would you actually pick? I mean, you're absolutely welcome to say a guided tour of the Thames Barrier, but is there anything else?
Well, actually, I didn't know that all these heads of state ended up staying at Buckingham Palace. So now, actually, that's exactly what I would like to do. And what's the equivalent, the Lincoln's bedroom in the White House is where heads of state go. So I don't know what the equivalent of that would be.
I don't know what the bedroom's called, but there's
a lot of them.
There's a royal suite, yes. It's not very luxurious, apparently.
What about you, William? If you were returned to London as head of state, perhaps the first king of a free Scotland?
I'm not sure. I've done everything in London I want to do in London. Maybe I sort of a private party at Ronnie Scott's where I could invite all my mates.
I'm sure Buckingham Palace would be able to organise that.
I'm sure they would.
Sir William Patey and Patricia Cohen, thank you both for joining us. And finally on today's show, in February 2024, when Russia launched its ongoing assault upon Ukraine, many looked, and quite rightly, for Ukrainian voices who could tell the story of their country's war for survival in real time. The one they found in greatest numbers was Illia Ponomarenko of the Kyiv Independent, whose intrepid reporting and droll social media commentary won him a colossal following. Illia has now distilled his recollections of the war's early weeks into a new book. I will show you how it was, the story of wartime Kyiv. I spoke to Illia earlier, and I began by asking him about his decision to return to Kyiv shortly after Russia attacked.
What was going on is that, within the first day of the invasion, there was a lot of mayhem, a lot of doom and gloom. We had little to no illusions about what was happening in there. We had so many voices just burying us all alive and giving Ukraine like 48 hours, 72 hours. I'm not saying that we absolutely believed, and me in particular, that we're absolutely doomed and there's like nothing can be done. But at the same time, we had little illusions about what's coming next, that it's going to be a terrible disaster and a catastrophe, and Russians will go brutal about this. Especially when it comes to hearing the sound of incoming missiles from all around the horizon, from inside the city. It's happening. It's really in there. But by the end of the first day of the invasion, there was sort of a pivotal moment that came to me and to so many people in this country. This moment was the sudden Russian failure at the Hostomel airfield. Yeah, Russians, in the first day of the invasion, following the missile barrage, they tried to land an elite airborne force. They were successful in this, but by the end of the day, it suddenly failed, and the Ukrainian military managed to take them out, essentially to regain control and thus undermine the first and super important step in the Russian plan of capturing Kyiv. And I remember this moment when I saw pictures of Ukrainian soldiers who were there, who just defeated an elite pack of Russian forces in Hostomel airfields, essentially saving Kyiv in many ways, making the first step in terms of saving Kyiv. And they were smiling, brilliantly smiling, and showing the turn-off Ukrainian flag from that facility, from the already disabled Ukrainian airport. And that was a moment when I realized that, hold on, this is not the end. Doomsday is not happening. We have a chance. We are in there. We can do it. And I'm absolutely sure that I would eventually come to this conclusion later on. But, so many incredible things that happened within the first days of the invasion. It's got so many people in their senses, and me in particular. So I realized that I'll be hating myself if I do not come back to my city, my people. I realized that we had a lot of our friends, journalists and also just regular people from our lives who were still in the city working or enlisting to the military. So we had hope, we had this dynamic, we had this passion within us. But at the same time, I must say that we had little to no illusions about what's coming next. So when I decided that I absolutely get back home, I leave my family behind in a safe place, and I get back home. My thoughts about coming back was that we'll be witnessing the Battle of Kyiv, we'll participate in it to the extent that we need it, either as journalists or actual people fighting. And maybe, just maybe, if we are lucky, we'll be able to get back and flee before it's too late.
The period the book chronicles, that early resistance of Ukraine's, is a period in which the rest of the world is suddenly learning a great deal about Ukraine, a country which I think probably most people didn't know all that much about. And one of the things that people did learn about Ukraine in that period was about the Ukrainian sense of humour. And I think it is important to emphasise to listeners that though your book describes a situation about as serious as a situation can get, it is also very funny. I'm just wondering, in terms of what you were thinking when you were writing the book, did you feel at all self-conscious about that, or did you decide to just think, well, no, people do laugh during war, people do find things to laugh at, and humour is important?
I must say that everything that I described in the book, it happened in reality. I invented absolutely nothing. And yeah, given my limitations of the size of the book, I also spared a lot of moments, a lot of absolutely crazy things happening to Ukraine and in general, the atmosphere. The thing is that, in such a pivotal moment, it's such a dark hour, that the very hour that Winston Churchill was once talking about, people tend to reveal absolutely unbelievable features about themselves. They reveal something that I sometimes describe as the defiance of the doomed. It's like, yeah, we're gonna die, but we will have a lot of fun in the end, and we will do what is right in there. So, like it always happens. It's a very integral part of human, psychology, of human nature, to be defiant, to be going on your extremes as a human being in terms of your psychological coping with the situation, in terms of the unity with other people next to you. That's why, for instance, it's just a particular case of that is that sometimes you can see soldiers, for instance, in intense combat, cracking jokes, insane jokes to each other, just because it's a sort of psychological mechanism of human being, in the pack, standing for each other and trying to support each other. Something similar was happening at the scale of the entire nation. And it was a period of time so full of incredible feelings and emotions, this outbreak of enthusiasm, this defiance, this unity, unbelievable unity of so many people, and so many people making this moral choice towards staying and fighting no matter what happens, rather than things like fleeing or just surrendering with little to no illusions. For instance, I will never forget things like seeing Ukraine's top hip hop star being part of the Home Guard unit, holding a rifle in his hand and singing patriotic songs in downtown Kyiv. He's a hip hop star. Incredible pictures of people who were of just absolutely regular people in the streets of Kyiv getting rifles from the police in the streets of northern districts of Kyiv, because we expected Russians to enter northern districts within the first days of the invasion. And very regular people were holding Kalashnikov rifles for the first time in their lives, and they were ready to fight and die in the streets. It's just incredible things happening.
That was Illia Ponomarenko. His new book is called I Will Show You How It Was, the Story of Wartime Kyiv, and it is heartily recommended. That is all for this edition of the Monocle Daily. Thanks to our panellists today, Patricia Cohen and Sir William Patey. Today's show was produced by Henry Rees Sheridan and researched by Gunnar Grunlid. Our sound engineer was Sarah Nichol. I'm Andrew Muller here in London. The Daily is back at the same time tomorrow. Thanks for listening.